Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I'm trying an experiment here. I'm collaborating with AI to make some videos about the history of technology with a connection to today. As a student of history myself, I'm curating events and themes from the past that I believe have something to teach us today. This collaboration allows me to explore these topics in depth and still be able to produce them with a team of just me. I know many of you do not like AI-generated content, so each of these videos will have a watermark at the beginning stating "made in collaboration with AI, so at least you'll know and you'll be able to choose or choose not to view them. Of course, my current topic videos will still be 100% me. Let me know what you think about this idea in the comments and any suggestions you have for how I can make these videos better. And now let's start with one of my favorite topics of all time, the Enigma machine and how Alan Turing and company managed to beat the Germans at the encryption game. There is an old warning attributed first to the philosopher George Santayana and later echoed by Winston Churchill: those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. It is a line so often quoted, so neatly self-contained, that it risks losing its weight. But what does it truly mean to learn from history, and what happens when nations and the men who lead them fail to do so? History does not repeat itself in detail. The actors change, the costumes change, the technology transforms the stage. But the rhythms, the fears, the pride, the assumptions, they return. Always they return. On this channel, we look to the past not to dwell in nostalgia, nor to moralize with the benefit of hindsight. We look to understand why things unfolded as they did, the decisions, the misjudgments, the certainties that proved brittle when tested, and we ask quietly, what might we learn before the rhythm begins again? This time our subject is a machine, one that promised certainty, a device its operators trusted so completely that they built empires of secrecy upon it. The German Enigma cipher of the Second World War was, to those who used it, the last word in secure communication. And yet it was broken, first by a handful of mathematicians in Poland, then by a vast and secret enterprise in Britain. The story of Enigma is not just about clever engineering or wartime code breaking. It is a case study in human confidence, in the ways we place faith in our own inventions, in the illusion that complexity equals safety, and in the quiet arrogance that blinds us to weakness until it's too late. Over the next hour, we'll explore that machine. How it worked, who broke it, the pride that kept its secrets unexamined, and, most importantly, what its rise and fall can teach us about our own age of algorithms and encrypted systems, because the lesson of Enigma is not confined to history. It's about trust, technology, and the limits of human certainty, and those rhythms, as always, return. Let's talk about a machine that many of its operators believed could not be broken, a device so trusted that generals, admirals, and heads of state built strategies and risked lives on the assumption of its perfection. The German Enigma cipher was supposed to turn plain language into fog, and for a time it did. But this is a story about what happens when confidence hardens into certainty, when a system grows so familiar, so seemingly airtight, that its users stop asking the right questions. We will spend an hour together on Enigma, how it came to be, who first broke it, how the British industrialized the attack, how German overconfidence held the door open, and what all of this suggests for the technologies we trust today. You may know parts of this story from films. The Imitation Game is a powerful movie, but it condenses timelines, shifts credit, and streamlines the messy collaboration that real history demands. The truth is more interesting. It reaches back to the 1920s, crosses borders, and takes us into cramped huts where mathematics, patience, and persistence met the daily pressure of war. Before we get to Bletchley Park and the names you know, we start earlier, with a quiet invention that moved from trade shows and sales brochures to warships and U-boats. To understand how Enigma could be broken, we need to understand why it earned such faith in the first place. The First World War left Europe obsessed with secrets. Nations had learned very painfully that radio was both a gift and a liability. Messages could travel quickly, they could also be heard by anyone with the right receiver. The question after 1918 was not whether to communicate in the open, it was how to hide in plain sight. Enter a class of machines built to scramble the alphabet itself, rotor cipher machines. The general idea had been around in the minds of inventors across Europe and America, but it was a German engineer, Arthur Scherbius, who would give the concept its most famous form. In 1918, he filed patents. In the early 1920s, he founded a company, and by the middle of the decade, he was traveling to trade fairs with a curious-looking typewriter that lit up letters instead of printing them. At first, it was a commercial pitch. Banks, railroads, and corporations were told they could use this device to keep proprietary messages safe from competitors. The sales were modest, but the machine itself, were quickly refined, would find its largest customer in the German state. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Army, the Navy, and eventually the Air Force adopted variations of Hubris's concept. The word Enigma would soon be stamped on a family of machines, each with slightly different features and procedures, all built around the same core idea: use mechanical motion to create moving alphabets that never line up the same way twice. Let's walk through how that works conversationally without leaning on diagrams. Imagine you sit at the Enigma keyboard and press the letter A. Inside the machine, electrical current runs through a set of disks, rotors, each wired internally in a scrambled pattern. As the signal passes through the rotors and a device at the back called the reflector, it emerges as a different letter, and that letter lights up on a display. You press A, perhaps Q lights up. Press A again, and this time V might appear. Why? Because with each key press, at least one rotor steps forward, changing the path of the current. The wiring doesn't move, but the alignment of the wiring changes, and with it, the mapping from input to output. This moving alphabet is the heart of Enigma's strength. A static substitution, A always becomes Q, B always becomes R, is easy to detect if someone sees enough messages. But a substitution that shifts with each letter, that's harder. Two additional features made it harder still. First, the plug board, a panel at the front with sockets for pairs of letters. Operators connected cords, think of them as small extension cables, to swap pairs on the way in and on the way out. If A and M were connected, then every A entering the machine first became M, every M became A. On the far side, after the rotors and the reflector had done their work, the signal passed back through the same plug board, swapping those pairs again. The plug board acted like a mask placed over a mask, compositing an extra layer of complexity on top of the rotor scrambling. Second, the reflector. After the current traveled forward through the rotors, the reflector sent it back along a different route. That design had a consequence cryptanalysts learned to love. No letter could ever encrypt to itself. In other words, A could never become A. Counterintuitive as it sounds, that small impossibility created leverage. If you know a letter in the plain text can't match the same position in the ciphertext, you can start crossing possibilities off quickly. It's a reminder that engineering choices, even clever ones, often have side effects. Operators didn't just turn the machine on and type. Each network of users, say a naval group or an army corps, had a daily key shared among its operators. That key told them which rotors to load and in what order, how to set the ring positions on each rotor, which plug board pairs to connect, and what the initial rotor positions should be when they began a message. Then came a procedural step that in the early years would prove fateful. To set up an individual message key, the operator would choose a short start sequence, essentially a private setting for that message, and send it to the recipient in a way both sides could reconstruct. The operator would then reset the machine to that private setting and type the actual text. The receiving station would reverse the process. If that all sounds like many moving parts, it was, but to the Germans that was the point. Complexity was a shield. Between the rotor choices, their order, the ring settings, the plug board pairs, and the starting positions, the theoretical number of configurations was astronomical. You will see different figures quoted because different branches use different numbers of rotors and different procedures at different times. The point is not the exact count, the point is the scale. To the men who relied on Enigma, the space of possibilities looked so vast that brute forcing to checking settings until one worked seemed beyond reach. Now, what made Enigma feel invulnerable wasn't just mathematics, it was experience. If you are an operator in a coastal radio hut and day after day your messages go out and operations proceed, you develop confidence. If you are a cryptographer testing the system internally and your controlled checks show the machine behaving as designed, your faith hardens. People are quick to attribute success to the wisdom of their tools, especially when those tools are complicated and prestigious. What we're going to see over and over is that the weak points were rarely inside the brass and bakelite. They were in procedures, habits, and assumptions. Let's pause on a few of those assumptions because they will matter later. Assumption 1, difficulty equals security. If a system is hard to explain and fiddly to operate, it must be secure. But complexity without discipline often creates surface area for mistakes. An operator tired at 3 in the morning might reuse a setting, or choose a lazy one, or include a predictable phrase at the start of a message to test his link, nothing to report, for example. The machine doesn't save you from human shortcuts. Assumption 2, big number equals unbreakable. It is true that the space of possible configurations was enormous. What that means is that a naive blind search is not practical. It does not mean that every configuration is equally likely in practice, or that you cannot use patterns in messages, known phrases, or captured manuals to narrow the field. If you know where to look, or if you can rearrange the problem to avoid searching at all, the big number recedes as a defense. Assumption 3, secrecy of design equals security. The Germans controlled the machine, the manuals, and the training. They ensured that details of operation stayed inside the services. But as many engineers now remind us, security through obscurity doesn't travel well. Once a design is used at scale, secrecy begins to leak through captured material, through observation, and most importantly, through repeated structured use that creates patterns an adversary can study. There is one more feature to underline before we leave the machine itself and step into the rooms where it was attacked. Enigma's reflector, as we noted, forced the no letter encrypts to itself rule. That seems a tiny detail, a footnote to an otherwise elegant architecture. It will become a lever, not the only lever, but a useful one for codebreakers who are willing to think in negative space, not just what could be true, but what cannot be true. Keep that in mind as a mental tool. Often the first step in solving a hard problem is pruning the tree, not climbing it. All right, we have the basic picture, a machine that takes every key press and sends it into a shifting maze, a plugboard that adds an extra layer of permutation, procedural keys that change daily, and a community of operators who have been told with conviction that this is safe. If you and I were looking at this in 1930 without the benefit of hindsight, we might well agree. So how did anyone find daylight in this maze? The first sustained daylight did not come from Britain, it came from Poland, from a small team of young mathematicians working under pressure, far from the seat of any empire, with little time and less margin for error. In the next section, we'll meet them properly. But to understand the magnitude of what they achieved, consider the constraints. They did not have modern computers, they did not have racks of specialized hardware. What they had was a chain of information from French intelligence, a willingness to model a machine as mathematics, and the intellectual discipline to turn the German procedures against the Germans. Before we go there, one last point about how to listen to the remaining hour. It's tempting to imagine that the story is a simple ladder, a clever idea here, a better machine there, and then the vault falls open. Real cryptanalysis rarely works that way. It's a braid. Technical insight is pulled together with procedural sloppiness, with captures at sea, with administrative change, with boredom, with courage, with grief. The Enigma story has all of that. It has the inventors and the breakers. It also has the radio operator who wanted his shift to end, the officer who reused a setting because no one was watching, the sailor who dove into cold water to seize a codebook from a sinking ship. The machine matters. The human being matters just as much. With that frame, let's close section 1 here. We've built the foundation, what Enigma is, why it inspired such trust, and where the cracks would eventually appear. Next, we go to Poznan and Warsaw, where 3 young mathematicians did something the German services did not anticipate. They treated the machine not as a talisman, but as a system, and systems, however complicated, can be understood. If the Enigma story were a film, this is the part few audiences ever see. No cinematic dramatization, no major English language script has yet given the Polish mathematicians their full due. But history is clear. They were the first to break the German military enigma. Not by luck, not by accident, and not with computers. They did it with algebra, logic, and a kind of disciplined audacity that the Germans themselves never imagined possible. To appreciate what they accomplished, imagine the context. The year is 1932. Poland is a young nation, scarcely more than a decade old, resurrected after more than a century of partition. To the west lies a resurgent Germany. To the east, the Soviet Union. Between them, Poland stands alone, rebuilding its institutions and military. It understands better than most that survival depends on foresight. In Warsaw, the Cipher Bureau of the Polish General Staff was charged with protecting the nation's own communications and, equally important, with reading those of its neighbors. In the early 1930s, intercepted German traffic was increasingly unreadable. The old manual codes had been replaced by something new. Mechanical, efficient, and impregnable. That device was Enigma. The Poles had already tried the conventional cryptanalytic methods, frequency counts, pattern tracking, brute persistence, nothing worked. And yet in 1931, a narrow opportunity appeared. Through the French intelligence service, a German insider, Hans Thilo Schmidt, was persuaded to sell information. He worked at the cipher office of the German Defense Ministry, and he had access to Enigma operating manuals and key lists. He passed copies of these documents to the French, who in turn shared them with their Polish allies. But there was a problem. The documents described how to use the machine, procedures, keys, formats, but not the internal wiring of the rotors. Without that, the machine's behavior could not be reconstructed. And this is where a young mathematician named Marian Rejewski entered the story. Rejewski was 27 years old, a graduate of Poznan University. He had studied mathematics under Zdzisław Krygowski, who believed that algebra, not mere trial and error, could break ciphers. In 1929, as tensions with Germany grew, the Polish military had quietly asked Krygowski to run a secret cryptology course for his top students. 20 students began, only a handful completed the course. Among them were Rejewski, Jerzy Rosiecki, and Henryk Zygalski, names that deserve to be as well known as Alan Turing's. After university, the three were recruited into the Cipher Bureau. They were not soldiers or spies in the romantic sense. They were analysts, logicians, pattern hunters. Rejewski especially possessed a gift for abstract thinking. He treated the machine not as a box of wires, but as a permutation system, a mathematical object that could, in theory, be modeled. Working from the German manuals and a small number of intercepted messages, he began building equations. Each rotor, he realized, could be represented as a permutation, a mapping of 26 letters to 26 others. The plugboard added another permutation at the front and back, and the reflector another in the middle. If he could isolate enough relationships between the input and output letters, he might be able to infer the wiring of the rotors themselves. This was not the sort of analysis anyone else was attempting. British cryptographers at the time were still treating Enigma as a linguistic puzzle. Rejewski treated it as a group theory problem. He was in essence doing applied algebra on an encrypted battlefield. Then came a critical stroke of reasoning. In 1930, German procedures required operators to encrypt the message key twice, once to encode it, then again to confirm it. For instance, if a radio operator chose ABL as his message key, he would type ablabel at the start of the message, using the daily setting shared by his network. That double encryption, meant as a safety check, was a fatal weakness. Because each encryption passed through the same machine, starting from different positions, it created mathematical relationships between the first and fourth letters, the second and fifth, the third and sixth. Rejewski realized he could use these patterns to build equations describing the combined effect of the rotors. The system was still immensely complex, more than 100 quintillion possible settings, but it was no longer an infinite mystery. The equations were solvable in principle, and that was enough. Over the course of late 1932 and early 1933, Rejewski worked patiently, testing assumptions, refining his algebra, and feeding intercepted data into his equations. By year's end, he had done what no one else in Europe had done. He deduced the internal wiring of the rotors. Once that was known, the Cipher Bureau could build its own replica Enigma machines, functionally identical to the German models. Polish engineers assembled them from scratch. By early 1933, the Polish team was reading German army traffic. That success was both exhilarating and fragile. They knew the Germans could change procedures at any time, so the Poles set about automating their work. Rosiecki devised a device he called the cyclometer, which cataloged rotor starting positions and their resulting permutations. Zygalski created perforated sheets, later called Zygalski sheets, that allowed analysts to overlay pattern sets and pinpoint rotor orders mechanically. Rejewski himself designed the Bomba Cryptologiczna, or cryptologic bomb, an electromechanical machine that used 6 Enigmas wired together to test possible settings automatically. This was 1938, 6 years before the first British bombay at Bletchley Park. Each of these inventions aimed to reduce the grinding manual labor of testing keys. If Enigma was a fortress, the Poles had built tools to probe its walls efficiently, using structure instead of brute force. By the summer of 1939, however, the ground was shifting. The Germans had changed the way operators indicated message keys. They added more plugboard connections, increasing complexity from roughly 10 pairs to as many as 13. The existing Polish techniques began to fail. And with invasion looming, the Cipher Bureau faced an impossible choice: guard their work as a national secret or share it with their allies before it was too late. They chose to share. On July 24, 1939, just weeks before Germany invaded Poland, representatives of the British and French intelligence services arrived at a forest compound outside Warsaw. The meeting took place in a villa at Pyry, south of the city. The Poles presented what they had, reconstructed Enigma machines, wiring diagrams, tables, Zygalski sheets, and details of their analytic methods. The British delegation, including Dilly Knox, a senior cryptanalyst, was astonished. They had made almost no progress on their own. Knox realized in an instant that the Polish work leapt them years ahead. The Poles handed over their designs freely. They asked for nothing in return. When war came 6 weeks later, the Polish cryptologists evacuated through Romania and France, continuing their work in exile. But their country fell quickly and communication became difficult. Some of their operations relocated to the Château de Vignoles near Paris under the codename PC Bruno. When France itself fell in 1940, the survivors moved again, eventually reuniting with the British effort in the United Kingdom. Not all made it. Jerzy Rosiecki died in January 1942 when the ship SS Le Mauriciere sank in the Mediterranean. Rejewski and Zygalski lived through the war, but their achievements remained secret for decades. Rejewski returned to Poland after the war, working quietly as an accountant under a regime that did not wish to celebrate pre-war intelligence ties with the West. Zygalski settled in Britain, teaching mathematics. Only in the 1970s did the world begin to acknowledge what they had done. It is hard to overstate their contribution. Without the Polish breakthroughs, the British would have started the war effectively blind to German traffic. With them, they began months ahead, armed with working machines and a framework for understanding how to attack Enigma as it evolved. The intellectual lineage from Poznan to Bletchley is direct. The bomb that Alan Turing designed in 1940 was a sophisticated descendant of Rejewski's 1938 bomba. There is within this story a larger theme, one that reaches forward to our own century. Security, whether in wartime codes or modern cybersecurity, depends on the assumption of uniqueness that one's system, one's encryption, one's secrets are so specific and so complex that outsiders cannot grasp them. But systems built by humans carry human fingerprints. The Poles saw those fingerprints, the repeated indicators, the mathematical symmetries, the procedural shortcuts, and they built their attack around them. It's a reminder that every system, no matter how advanced, carries within it the habits and assumptions of its designers, and those habits in time become the weakest link. When the Polish team handed over their work at Pyry, they did not know how soon war would come or whether Britain would even stand. They acted on a principle that remains as relevant in today's digital age as it was in 1939. That security is not achieved by hoarding knowledge, but by shared understanding, collaboration, trust, and the humility to let others improve what you've built. Next, we'll travel to England, to a country under bombardment, building a secret city of intelligence at Bletchley Park. There, Alan Turing and his colleagues would take the Polish Foundation and turn it into an industrial-scale operation, one that read the enemy's mail in near real time. But the seed was planted in Poland by 3 young mathematicians who proved that no code, however clever, can stand forever against human insight. When the British delegation left the Pyry meeting in July of 1939, they carried with them a quiet miracle and a heavy responsibility. They knew what few in their intelligence community yet believed. The Enigma system was not unbreakable. It had already been broken. But that knowledge, as events would prove, was only a beginning. Poland had shown the door could be opened. Now Britain would have to keep it open every single day against a system designed to change with each sunrise. In early September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. By the end of the month, Poland had fallen. What had been a 3-nation collaboration became a British-led enterprise charged with continuing the fight on a scale the Poles could only have dreamed of. The Government Code and Cipher School, known by its initials GC and CS, had already moved its wartime headquarters to a Victorian estate 50 miles northwest of London, Bletchley Park. To an untrained eye, it looked unremarkable, a sprawling country house surrounded by lawns and hedges tucked behind modest gates. But behind those gates, Britain began building something unprecedented, a fusion of mathematics, linguistics, engineering, and clerical labor, all devoted to reading the enemy's mind. The effort started small. When the first staff arrived in August 1939, they could fit in a single room. Within 3 years, more than 10,000 people worked there. Soldiers, mathematicians, linguists, engineers, typists, and countless clerks. They came from universities, from the military, from civil service exams, and in many cases by accident. Bletchley Park was not glamorous. The huts were drafty, the food was plain, secrecy forbade nearly all conversation outside the grounds. And yet by 1943, this quiet campus was producing some of the most consequential intelligence of the entire war. The first challenge facing the British was to adapt the Polish methods to the new wartime Enigma. The German military had expanded its plugboard connections and altered operational procedures, rendering the Polish bomba less effective. So the British had to rethink the process. Enter Alan Turing. Turing had been recruited to GC and CS in 1938 after studying mathematics at Cambridge. He was brilliant, unconventional, and impatient with bureaucracy, a thinker who preferred elegant logic to formal hierarchy. He took the Polish insights as a starting point, then reframed the problem in his own way. Rather than trying to solve Enigma directly, he asked how one might test hypotheses quickly. Could you build a machine that didn't just emulate Enigma, but reasoned about Enigma, searching vast spaces for self-contradictions and eliminating impossibilities? The answer became the Bomb Bay, a machine Turing designed with major refinements by another mathematician, Gordon Welchman. Each Bombay contained dozens of rotating drums representing Enigma rotors. When operators supplied a crib, a suspected piece of plain text likely to appear in a message, such as a weather phrase or a standard greeting, the Bombay would test rotor combinations until it found one that produced a consistent mapping between cipher and plain text, obeying Enigma's rules. It didn't decrypt messages directly, it told analysts which rotor settings to try next on a real Enigma. Think of it as a logic engine, an early form of automated reasoning. The first Bombay, named Victory, became operational in March 1940. It was electromechanical, whirring with hundreds of wires, switches, and relays. Within months, more machines followed, each faster, more refined, and more reliable than the last. By 1943, more than 200 Bombays were operating across Britain, staffed largely by members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens. Day and night, they stood at the rows of spinning drums, listening for the telltale click that meant a contradiction had been found or eliminated. It is impossible to overstate how human this process remained. The Bombay was powerful, but it was not magic. It depended on intuition, on the right guess, the right crib, the right hunch about a message. And those guesses came from analysts working in small wooden huts, surrounded by chalkboards, papers, and cigarette smoke. Dilly Knox, the eccentric classical scholar who had attended the 1939 Pyre meeting, continued his work on Enigma alongside a small team of women cryptanalysts. Among them was Mavis Lever, later Mavis Beatty, who would achieve one of the early triumphs of Bletchley Park. In March 1941, working with Knox, she broke the Italian naval Enigma, deciphering messages that led directly to the British victory at Cape Matapan in the Mediterranean. Her insight came from noticing a repeated pattern, an operator who used the same message key twice, an echo of the flaw the Poles had exploited years earlier. That small procedural error cost the Italian fleet dearly. Other huts specialized in different Enigma networks, the German Army, the Luftwaffe, the Abwehr Intelligence Service, but the hardest problem of all was naval Enigma, used by the Kriegsmarine to coordinate U-boat attacks in the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was, at its core, a logistical nightmare. Britain depended on supply convoys from North America. German submarines prowled those routes, guided by encrypted orders transmitted via Enigma. To keep the lifeline open, Bletchley Park had to read those orders, and do it fast enough for the information to be useful. Naval Enigma was tougher for several reasons. It used a different version of the machine, with more rotors and more frequent key changes. The traffic was dense, the stakes enormous. The intelligence unit responsible, Hut 8, was led by Turing himself. Alongside him worked Hugh Alexander, Stuart Milner Barry, and a team of mostly young mathematicians, engineers, and linguists. They invented new analytical methods such as Banburismus, a probabilistic technique that allowed them to eliminate impossible rotor settings before running the Bombays, reducing computation time drastically. Even so, progress was uneven. At times, the German Navy's procedural changes plunged Bletchley into darkness for weeks. Only when Allied ships captured key materials, codebooks, rotor wirings, indicator tables, could the cryptanalysts catch up. One of the most famous captures came in October 1942. The British destroyer HMS Petard engaged the German submarine U-559 in the Mediterranean. After a prolonged attack, the U-boat surfaced, its crew abandoning ship. 3 British sailors boarded the sinking vessel to seize documents and equipment. They succeeded, passing the codebooks up through the conning tower. Moments later, the submarine went down, taking 2 of the boarders with it, Lieutenant Tony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier. Their sacrifice provided the material that broke a new version of naval Enigma, saving countless lives in the months that followed. The ethical tension of that moment, knowing that intelligence depends on both intellect and peril, hung over Bletchley Park. Every success was written in risk. Every decrypted message came from someone's decision somewhere to take that risk. As the work expanded, so did the infrastructure. Each hut or block became a specialized unit. Hut 6 handled Army and Air Force Enigma. Hut 8 handled the Navy. Hut 3 interpreted the results and produced intelligence summaries for commanders. Messages that passed through the system were marked Most Secret Ultra. They could only be shown to those cleared for the highest level of secrecy. Ultra, the codename for decrypted Enigma traffic, became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, even within Britain's own military. The analysts faced a paradox. The more they read, the more they had to restrain themselves. If the Germans suspected that Enigma had been compromised, they could change it overnight. So Bletchley Park carefully managed how its intelligence was used. Convoys were rerouted only when other plausible explanations, reconnaissance radar chance, could justify the change. It was intelligence with brakes on, a victory that had to hide itself to survive. At its height, Bletchley Park's operation was a small city of logic. Thousands of intercepts arrived daily by teleprinter and motorcycle courier from listening stations across Britain. Messages were logged, sorted, and distributed to the appropriate hut. Teams worked in shifts around the clock. There was exhaustion, monotony, and occasional elation, the small private triumph of watching an indecipherable jumble of letters resolve into meaning. Among the many faces at Bletchley, a few became symbols of the broader story. Alan Turing, whose bombing machines underpinned much of the success, was a reserved and sometimes awkward man, more comfortable with equations than with small talk. After the war, he would be prosecuted for homosexuality, a conviction that drove him to suicide in 1954. His name, later cleared, has become emblematic of both human brilliance and human injustice. Gordon Welchman, less well known, was equally crucial. His idea of the diagonal board made the bombs vastly more efficient. He later emigrated to the United States and worked on secure communications, a natural evolution from the code-breaking of his youth. Joan Clark, Turing's friend and fellow mathematician, played a vital role in Hut 8. As one of the few women in an analytical post, she fought both sexism and the secrecy that kept her contributions invisible for decades. Her calm precision and her insight into Enigma procedures made her indispensable. The success of Bletchley Park did not end the war, but it shortened it. Historians debate by how much, some say 2 years, others 4, but all agree that it saved lives. Enigma decrypts guided Allied forces in North Africa, helped win the Battle of the Atlantic, and shaped planning for D-Day. The flow of ultra-intelligence was so vital that Churchill called Bletchley's workers the geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled. And yet, despite its scale and impact, the entire enterprise remained hidden from public view until the 1970s. Tens of thousands of veterans carried their silence for life. They had signed the Official Secrets Act. They told no one, not spouses, not children, what they had done. When the story finally became public, many were already gone. Looking back, what stands out is not just the technological leap, but the organizational imagination. Britain built, under wartime urgency, a prototype for the modern information age. Distributed computation, interdisciplinary teams, parallel processing of data. The codebreakers of Bletchley Park worked on punch cards, paper, and logic diagrams, but the structure of their enterprise foreshadowed the digital world we now inhabit. The combination of human reasoning with mechanical assistance was the embryo of today's human-computer symbiosis. It is tempting to view Bletchley Park as a triumph of pure intellect, but it was also a triumph of coordination, of people who trusted one another across boundaries of class, gender, and expertise. A classicist could work beside an engineer, a linguist beside a mathematician. They shared no uniform but secrecy itself. Their diversity was not ornamental, it was essential. Each mind brought a different way of seeing patterns in noise. That principle, that complex problems demand many kinds of minds, is as true today as it was then. When we confront the challenges of cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, or information warfare, we face systems every bit as intricate as Enigma, and the solution will not come from any single discipline or algorithm. It will come, as it did at Bletchley Park, from the collaboration of human insight with machinery structured by shared purpose. By 1944, the machines in the huts were running almost continuously, their operators working in shifts that blurred into one another. The intelligence summaries went out to commanders under carefully chosen cover stories, and somewhere in the rhythm of the typewriters and the hum of the bombies, you could hear a new kind of sound, the sound of computation becoming industrial. The Polish mathematicians had shown that Enigma could be understood. Bletchley Park proved that understanding could be scaled. It was not just a battle of intellect, but a logistical campaign fought with wiring wiring diagrams, paper forms, and perseverance. If the Poles had built the blueprint, the British turned it into an assembly line for insight. As we move into the next chapter, we'll look at the other side of the mirror, at the Germans themselves. Because even as the Allies built a vast apparatus to read Enigma, the Germans remained convinced that their system was secure. They saw losses, yes, but they explained them away. To luck, to radar, to spies. The truth, too strange to be believed, was that their own faith in their machine had become their undoing. That faith and the blindness it bred is our next lesson. For technology, no matter how sophisticated, is never stronger than the assumptions of the people who use it. And hubris, as history shows us again and again, encrypts nothing. If Bletchley Park was a triumph of insight, the German side of the story was a study in denial. Even as the Allies read more of their traffic each month, most of the German high command remained convinced that Enigma was secure. It is difficult in retrospect to understand how they could have been so sure, but certainty is a powerful narcotic, and Enigma had become part of the German military's identity, a symbol of precision, engineering, and superiority. To doubt the machine was to doubt themselves. The cult of the unbreakable machine, from its earliest adoption, Enigma carried an aura of infallibility. It was German technology born of German engineering. Its design was elegant, its mathematics sound, its procedures strict. Officers were taught to treat it as unassailable. Manuals described it as nicht zu knacken, unbreakable. That phrase was repeated until it hardened into doctrine. To be fair, their confidence had reason. The combinatorial space was vast. The procedures were, on paper, rigorous. The idea that a foreign power might not only replicate the machine, but analyze its internal logic seemed absurd. And because the Germans themselves occasionally tested captured Allied ciphers and found them weak, they assumed their opponents faced similar limitations. That assumption held even as the war turned against them. By 1942, Allied forces were anticipating convoy attacks, striking at U-boats with uncanny timing, and winning naval engagements that should have been blind. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, began to suspect that something was wrong. He ordered multiple reviews of cryptographic procedures, each time concluding that Enigma remained unbroken. The losses, he was told, must be due to radar or direction finding, the new British technologies that had become the terror of U-boat crews. And radar indeed did play its part, but it was only half the story. The other half was that Bletchley Park was reading the daily traffic of the U-boat command. Orders, patrol routes, rendezvous coordinates, all of it. The Germans were watching their submarines vanish without understanding how the enemy knew where they would be. The pattern of overconfidence repeated across branches of the Wehrmacht. Whenever an unexpected defeat occurred, local commanders blamed leaks, spies, or chance. They could not conceive that their encryption, like, the spine of their communication network, had been breached. After all, no one inside Germany had ever demonstrated such a break themselves. The assumption followed that if they couldn't do it, no one else could. The psychology of faith. That assumption reveals something more general about human nature, something that applies well beyond wartime cryptography. Once a system has been declared unbreakable, it takes extraordinary evidence to convince its users otherwise. This is the psychology of faith in technology, belief reinforced by habit and habit reinforced by pride. For German operators, Enigma was not just a tool, it was a ritual. They carried the machines carefully, kept them under lock and key, burned their key sheets nightly. Their training emphasized discipline, secrecy, precision. That discipline became a form of comfort. If you followed procedure, the system would protect you. But as every engineer knows, security is not a product of obedience alone. It is the product of design and of use. And the Germans, despite their doctrine, were still human. They made mistakes, the kind every large organization makes. Operators reused message keys. They fell into habits sending test messages like Heil Hitler or nothing to report. They chose initials of girlfriends or children for settings. They sometimes forgot to change rotors or plug board pairs at the mandated hour. Each of those small slips created patterns, and patterns are what codebreakers live for. Inside Bletchley Park, analysts developed a dark respect for these predictable habits. They even gave them a name, sillies, slang for careless operator errors. The nickname came from one operator who repeatedly used the same three-letter sequence, CIL, likely a girlfriend's name. What to him was affection, to Bletchley was opportunity, the missed warnings. There were moments when the Germans came dangerously close to recognizing the truth. On several occasions, small groups within the cryptographic establishment raised doubts. A few naval intelligence officers noticed that Allied convoys seemed to avoid ambushes with uncanny regularity. Some suspected a breach. In 1944, a mathematician named Wilhelm Trano, working at the Naval Cipher Office, proposed that Allied successes might be due to systematic decryption of Enigma. He even performed tests on captured Allied messages to compare methods, but his conclusions were dismissed as improbable. It is easy from the distance of decades to call that arrogance. But in fairness, the Germans were not entirely irrational. Breaking Enigma did seem implausible, especially at the speed the Allies were achieving. To imagine an adversary running hundreds of electromechanical bombers around the clock, supported by thousands of personnel, was beyond their conception of Allied capacity. They knew Britain was strained, short on resources under air attack. The idea that such an enterprise could exist unseen in the English countryside felt like fantasy. They had underestimated not just the intellect of their opponents, but their organization. The moral of the mirror. When we look back at this blindness, it's tempting to treat it as a historical curiosity, the pride of an authoritarian regime that mistook rigidity for strength. But there's something more general at work here, something that speaks to every age of technology. Confidence in one's systems is necessary. Without it, nothing functions. But when confidence turns into dogma, when it becomes forbidden to question assumptions, error becomes inevitable. The Germans' greatest failure was not mathematical, it was epistemological. They confused difficulty with impossibility. They believed that what they could not imagine, others could not achieve. The lesson extends directly to our own century. In cybersecurity, in AI systems, in digital infrastructure, we hear similar assurances that encryption is unbreakable, that algorithms are unbiased, that models are too complex to be manipulated. Each generation repeats its own version of nicht zu knacken. But as the Enigma story shows, no system built by humans is beyond failure, and no human system is beyond hubris. By 1944, German cryptographic discipline had tightened. Operators rotated keys more frequently. The Navy introduced the four-rotor Enigma, hoping to restore security. But the changes came too late. Allied forces had already built bombs capable of handling the additional complexity. Captured materials continued to arrive from the sea. The intelligence advantage became irreversible. And yet, to the end, the German leadership refused to believe their cipher was compromised. When questioned after the war, Donitz insisted that Enigma had never been broken. Even confronted with Allied documents proving otherwise, some officers held fast to denial. They preferred to think they had been betrayed by spies than outwitted by mathematics. There is a haunting symmetry here. The same overconfidence that convinced the Germans their machine was unbreakable also convinced the Allies to guard the secret of its breaking long after victory. For decades, the very existence of ultra-intelligence remained hidden, lest future generations learn too much about the methods used. Both sides in their own way clung to secrecy, one born of pride, the other of prudence. If we step back, the German story completes a cycle. At first comes invention, the machine admired and trusted, then normalization, daily use, growing confidence, then faith, the belief that the system is perfect, and finally failure, not of the device but of imagination. That pattern repeats wherever technology meets power. We see it in finance, in data security, in artificial intelligence. Complex systems create an illusion of mastery. They promise control, but they also multiply the ways control can be lost. The German cryptographers were brilliant, but their brilliance became a cage. They trusted their calculations more than their curiosity. They forgot that the mind of an adversary can always evolve. The cost of hubris. By the last year of the war, German communications were being read almost in real time. Allied analysts could watch directives flow from Berlin to the front lines and predict operations days ahead. The advantage saved convoys, redirected bombers, shortened battles, but the psychological dimension was equally important. To know your enemy's mind while your enemy believes himself unreadable is a quiet, devastating power. The Germans fought on, blind to the fact that much of their planning unfolded on a stage already illuminated. After the war, as the Enigma story slowly emerged, survivors on both sides were struck by the same irony, that the machine designed to guarantee secrecy had, by its very design, revealed more about human nature than any message it ever enciphered. It showed how intelligence and arrogance often share a border so thin that one becomes the other. And so, as we consider Enigma's fall, we should resist the urge to see it only as a wartime anecdote. It is, at heart, a parable about trust misplaced, about the seduction intersection of complexity and the danger of believing that technology absolves us from vigilance. Every field touched by modern computing now faces its own Enigma moment, the confrontation between faith in systems and the unpredictable creativity of those who seek to understand them. Next, we'll close our story with the reflections and lessons that remain. We'll look at what this episode, from invention to hubris to collapse, can teach us about how we build and protect systems today, because while the machines have changed, the pattern of human behavior has not. The rhythm, as always, returns. The story of Enigma often ends with victory. Allied ships saved, Axis plans exposed, the war shortened. But to stop there is to miss the deeper resonance, the reason this story still matters long after the clatter of the bombies has faded into memory. Because what Enigma reveals is not only how codes are broken, but how certainty breaks us. The fragility of secrets. Every system we build carries two layers of vulnerability, the mathematical and the human. Enigma was strong in the first and weak in the second. Its wiring, plugboard, and rotors were feats of engineering, but its procedures, the way people used it, the shortcuts they took, the assumptions they made, were its undoing. Modern systems are no different. We speak of end-to-end encryption, of secure networks and unbreakable algorithms, but most breaches today do not come from the mathematics. They come from passwords reused, patches ignored, data shared too freely. We continue to repeat the German mistake, mistaking difficulty for immunity and human intention for human reliability. Security is not a state one achieves, it is a practice one maintains. The moment we decide that a system is unassailable, we stop seeing where it is vulnerable. That was true of Enigma in 1941, and it is true of our digital lives today. Collaboration over secrecy. One of the most striking aspects of the Enigma saga is how much depended on collaboration. The Polish mathematicians who began the work could easily have kept their discoveries secret, saving them as a national advantage. Instead, they chose to share them freely, urgently, and without guarantee of recognition. That act of intellectual generosity changed the course of the war. The British, in turn, built Bletchley Park on the same principle. Mathematicians, engineers, linguists, typists, and soldiers worked side by side across class and gender lines in an early prototype of the interdisciplinary teams that now drive technology forward. They showed that secrecy and collaboration can coexist, that even in a world of compartmentalized information, progress requires trust. In our era of proprietary algorithms and corporate competition, that lesson bears repeating. When security becomes a private race rather than a shared responsibility, we all lose. The challenges ahead, quantum computing, AI safety, digital privacy, will not be solved in isolation. They will be solved, if at all, by cooperation across borders and disciplines, by the same humility that allowed Polish, British, and American minds to join forces against Enigma. Another enduring question from Bletchley Park is the moral cost of knowing too much. The Codebreakers faced decisions few people will ever confront, whether to act on intelligence that could save lives at the risk of revealing that they could read the enemy's messages. Sometimes they let convoys sail into danger rather than betray their secret. Sometimes they watched events unfold that they could not stop. Knowledge they learned carries its own kind of burden. That dilemma has not gone away. Today it appears in new forms: the power of surveillance, the reach of data mining, the predictive capabilities of AI. We now possess tools for understanding human behavior that rival in scope anything the wartime cryptanalysts could imagine. And we face the same question they did: when does the pursuit of understanding become an act of intrusion? How much should we know, and at what cost? The story of Enigma is not just about intelligence, it is about restraint, the discipline to know what you know and still choose when and how to use it. The price of progress. Alan Turing's fate casts a long shadow over this story. Here was a man whose intellect helped save millions, whose work laid the foundations for modern computing, and who was destroyed by the prejudice of his own society. It is easy to romanticize Bletchley Park as a triumph of logic over tyranny, but its aftermath reminds us that victory in one domain does not guarantee wisdom in another. A nation that benefited from Turing's genius failed to protect him from its own intolerance. That failure, too, carries a lesson for the modern age. We live in a time when innovation moves faster than the ethics meant to guide it. We celebrate inventors but often ignore the conditions that allow them to think freely and safely. The test of a society is not how it rewards genius in wartime, but how it treats it in peace. The rhythm returns. If we zoom out, the Enigma story is one cycle in a repeating rhythm. A new technology promises security and control. People place their faith in it. A few skeptics question it. Eventually, the system fails. Not because it was poorly designed, but because it was perfectly trusted. Then we begin again, convinced that this time we've learned. We see this rhythm in our financial systems, in our data networks, in artificial intelligence. We create complex machines, then convince ourselves that they are too intricate to fail, too advanced to fool. We tell ourselves that what happened before cannot happen again, and in that moment the repetition begins. Learning from history does not mean predicting every failure. It means recognizing the pattern when we see it. It means cultivating the humility to question what we believe to be certain. The last message ever sent on an Enigma machine was transmitted on May 7, 1945, the day before Germany's surrender. It was a simple farewell from a German naval station in Norway. "We are closing down now. All the best. Goodbye." It arrived in clear text within hours, read by men and women at Bletchley Park who had spent years untangling such messages. The machine that had promised absolute secrecy ended its life with a wave goodbye, a symbol of how all technologies, no matter how powerful, are temporary. But what endured was not the machine, it was the method, the belief that no system is beyond understanding and that persistence, creativity, and collaboration can pierce even the darkest code. That belief built the foundations of computer science, information theory, and modern encryption itself. And it endures still as both inspiration and warning. Our machines have grown faster, our codes longer, our networks wider. But the human factors, while we're curiosity, pride, error, courage, remain unchanged. We are still the same species that built Enigma and broke it, the same species that confuses complexity with wisdom and then learns briefly to tell the difference. So what might we learn before the rhythm begins again? Perhaps that secrecy, like faith, is only as strong as our willingness to question it, that the greatest breakthroughs come not from certainty, but from doubt, and that history, when we listen closely, is not warning us of repetition, it is inviting us to recognize ourselves. The Enigma machine was a marvel of engineering, but the real story is human, the arrogance that built it, the patience that broke it, and the lessons that remain for anyone who trusts too much in their own creation, because the next Enigma will not have rotors or plug boards. It will have code, algorithms, and neural networks. It will promise safety and control just as the last one did, and somewhere someone will be working quietly to prove that promise wrong. The rhythms, the fears, the pride, the assumptions return. Always they return.